Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Debate Hub. I am Chesh, your master debater, and baby got backstories. Landon is here to join us today. You know Landon from Debate Hub. You know Landon from Landon's work all over the internet and all over the internet's history as a local astronomer.
Yeah, and a few things that some people, while I was not there on the first internet connection, I was there pretty close to the first internet connection.
Absolutely.
But that's another story. Yes, so I hope you're enjoying the internet. Many of those that work to create it could envision how important it's become, but I think way underestimated its impact on society. So I'm hoping that this impact will be positive for you. However, I am here under duress.
I thought you might say that. People are gonna think that I'm the one putting you under duress when you say it like that. It's
well,
hard. Go on.
But I do appreciate the privilege of being able to work with Goblin to be able to try and give you some information about Tariff and Liberation Day stuff.
All right, Landon, would you call yourself a math guy?
Yeah, I'm a mathematician, astronomer, physicist, planetary scientist, cryptographer. Which, by the way, ended up cryptography and the techniques of cryptography helped me do what we're about to do. Because as a person who is math centric and loved, I count before I could give you the letters, right? When I see a bunch of numbers, I look for relationships. People I call patterns. And if it doesn't seem like a pattern, I look to say, well, maybe there's some hidden context underneath. And that's where I began this dive of can I figure out how to reproduce stuff that came out? And then just digging and using their data. I mentioned to Chesh that I was able to reverse engineer, if you will. That means giving data back up to the possible method to derive it. About Liberation Day tariff values. And that is an interesting story because if you look at the mechanism behind it, it tells you something about the policy and about how it came about. Now, I believe in this presentation, I don't believe that Agent Orange, otherwise known as Donald Trump, has any understanding about what I'm about to produce.
Sure.
I think he simply saw the numbers being what he wanted good. My guess is some poor intern someplace was tasked with come up with a bunch of numbers and rationalize it. And they did so. And then people took this and said, oh, this looks impressive. They put their own spin on it, and the result is what we have.
I think people underestimate the ease at which numbers can be manipulated. The same way someone can manipulate words or verbiage to think something or say something, you can manipulate numbers the same way to make them look a certain way or sound a certain way or seem a way that they may not necessarily be the most honest option. Now,
yeah, so, and the numbers can be driven fallacy because I could say Chesh is right this one time,
right,
and then Chesh has only been right one time,
right,
and it's a fallacy thing. But I've used the numbers to say the number of times that Chesh has been right is one.
Yeah. So you can easily like take numbers and manipulate them the same way you can take or manipulate words. And you're suggesting that you don't think Trump is like a math guy. So he might be like fine at schmoozing. He might be fine at convincing people to vote for him, for example. He might be fine at getting people to participate. But he's not. You don't think that his number crunching skills are are as high as you would hope.
No, even though he claims that, he's a business person and he has all this money, therefore he understands numbers. I don't expect it. My in trying to develop a model for who is Agent Orange, who is Donald Trump. My models are not necessarily the real thing. They're like
a representation that represents a portion, not the whole.
Yes, and I think one of the things that I think fundamentally he believes he has this superhuman ability to walk into a conflict, size it up with his gut feeling, and say you're hired and you're fired. Right? That's sort of his shtick.
He's got he's got like this intuition. I think is the word.
Yeah, and I think he would even say that he could negotiate between God and devil.
Oh, sure.
Right. I think he had that level of belief in his negotiating skills.
And I strive to have that level of self-confidence.
And the other bit, of course, is that conflicts are opportunities for him. He enjoys weighing in on stuff. He also doesn't necessarily have to have it be concluding for himself, right? He doesn't have to be the one that ends up deciding. He weighs in on it and sides the situation as a gut feeling, which is where people that try to advise the current president of the United States on matters, he doesn't want to hear it. He says, you're about ready to meet let's say the leader Sierra Leone.
It sounds like
don't care.
Is
Sierra Leone even a real place? And he'll come in and the way the person shakes their hand tells him he likes them or not.
Are you suggesting to me that Trump views himself as more of an advisor than a decision maker?
No, he is more of a decider.
Oh, okay.
So
decides,
right? He's brought in.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And so given a conflict, given a problem, he weighs on it without being bothered by briefing and backstory.
Sure, context.
Gets a gut feeling and makes a pronouncement.
Right.
And he enjoys that thoroughly. He really enjoys that. So much so that he doesn't see the need to avoid a conflict. He doesn't see a need to avoid a calamity or a travesty, right?
Well,
those are opportunities for him to weigh in and do his you're hired, you're fired stuff. And the other thing that's remarkable is it doesn't matter whether or not the people pay attention to what he does. He enjoys the pronouncing. And so when he comes up with people who know how to manipulate him, he doesn't care because he got his thing, he did his shtick, and he moves on.
Right. He's already by the time the consequences are coming to fruition, he's already moved on and it's not a concern for him.
Yeah. So seeing a budget crisis occur, see a government shutdown occur, seeing a economic collapse occur are just more opportunities for him to do his you're hired, you're fired thing. Right?
Well, I mean, we've literally seen him recently say that this current economy is a Biden economy. Like, this is a Biden issue. He does not, I don't think that there's a single issue going on that he views or he takes ownership of, right? Because he doesn't take ownership.
And also these transactions are all independent too.
Right.
So he may have weighed in on the NAFTA stuff and came up with here's a new trade deal, North American trade deal. It doesn't matter that he is the one who negotiated the trade deal with Canada that he now says is bad. In fact, if you point it out to him, he wouldn't care because he's on to his next opportunity, which is doing this negotiation. And he thoroughly enjoys, I think he's correct in saying that there's these world leaders, economic people coming to him saying, wait a minute, there's a calamity here, and he goes, oh, I can fix this. I can fix this.
I can fix the calamity that I caused.
And he doesn't care if he calls it because it's an opportunity for him to do his stick of you're hired, you're fired thing, right? And calling him on previous actions creates decisions
doesn't
saying
matter.
that conflict doesn't care.
Yeah. Yeah. It's more like a bulldozer. Like, does a bulldozer care that it flattened a squirrel 20 minutes ago? No, a bulldozer doesn't care.
No.
It doesn't have
No.
any affection that way. But you have
So,
put together for us something
yes.
specific. So those are kind of your opinions
Yes.
on like Trump the person and Trump's approach. But we're here to talk about the math today. So we don't need to worry about his social impropriety or acceptability, however you personally see that. Today we're here to crunch some fucking numbers. Speak Greek to me, Landon. Speak Greek to me. What do you got?
All right. So let me go and screen share here.
Yeah, let me make this a little bit easier for you all to see. There you go.
Okay, so this is our feature presentation. We're going to basically do reverse engineering the Trump tariff equations that he made on April 2nd. By the way, I mentioned April 2nd because he's changing those things as we speak. And I'm not trying to rationalize the policy or so forth. I'm just trying to tell you what happened, which is I saw a bunch of numbers. And as a math person, I began to look for patterns and for relationships in those numbers. Saw a bunch of things and then saw what would look like a bunch of disconnected numbers. But the cartographer in me said, well, let me see if I can find an underlying pattern and develop a reverse engineer. And some of that included even going to websites. So I'll show you here. Do we have, let me show you, let me switch over on the screen sharing to the other bit. I'm going to stop sharing the window and show you a website. Everything I'm going to show you here is on, it's on a web page, right? This is all, I'm going to show you, it's all data on the web page. This is the reference that it is, and you'll see here, and by the links are in this presentation, and the PDF I can share with people, all this stuff. You see all these executive orders that he does, and we're going to talk about this section here, which is this so-called, the April 2nd debacle. Now there's more.
Which website is this? So it said the
office. So this is the USTR.gov, USTrade.gov. USTR.gov. And again, there are links in the description. And I'll give you the links for all this stuff. But I wanted to show you when you go to there on presidential tariff actions, he has lots and lots of actions. Each one of these things is a link to more stuff. And so the so-called Liberation Day is this section here, and there's going to be more stuff here. By the time you see this, there'll be even more executive orders because he likes to do that. Now,
so you're saying that the source of the information that you're using to delineate these numbers, where they're coming from and what they are, is from Trump's own declarations that are publicly available on this website.
Yeah, this is a part of the office of the President of the United States. This is actually on whitehouse.gov, presidential actions, I, Donald Trump, blah, 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 blah. So the one in particular we're covering is April 2nd, because probably by the time people see this, things will have changed yet again. But April 2nd was this particular really landmark thing that hit the economy. And so it's one of those things he talks about, blah, 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 blah stuff. But it gives links to things that if you start looking into them, you have this annex with all these countries listed, but only a few. Kind of curious.
These are the charts that he showed during his press conference, right? Where he was holding.
No, this is not the charts. This is the data behind the charts.
Oh, okay.
And interesting enough, this list of countries is actually fairly small, right? There's a longer list, and if you get into trade stuff, you get all these codes where you have every good has some sort of number that gets a certain tariff thing, and so you see a bunch of stuff now. He's talking about this duty and that duty on these countries. There is in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, that's USTR. You'll see a link again. There are things where you can look at a given country. And so if we look at something like Canada, click on Canada, it goes and says here, trade summary, and talked about the trade agreement, and talked about who's in, according to the U.S., how much they sold to us, how much we sold to them, and trade deficit or surplus stuff. So you can see a bunch of that data, right, that they use, because this data is going to become important. We'll see a little bit later on. One in particular is that they released the reciprocal tariff calculations, which is a bunch of rationalization and some symbols, but even that isn't quite correct. Doesn't deal with all the data. It has some odd things we'll look at. For some other data you can look at in Wikipedia, there's a page called Trump's Liberation Day Tariffs, and has a bunch of data there that, like Wikipedia, there's grains of truth, but you have to look at some of the sources. In particular, if you go down all these references, a bunch of references that are fairly useful. So we're going to look at, that's the source of the data when I started looking into it. Now, another thing I should mention in my style of stuff is that every page typically has a picture or a diagram, because if you're bored with all the words, some people like to look at pictures. I have attributions to all things. I'm not stealing, so this is a image credit. Even you can link on there, you can see where I got the.
This man has proper sources and citations. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And by the way, it's shared under basically the share alike thing. You can share it as long as you can. So we had this Rose Garden event and Liberation Day announcement, and he held up this first sort of chart. They were going to put out lots of charts, but it was kind of windy, so the people doing the Rose Garden presentation didn't figure out how to take large pieces of cardboard and secure them without having them blow over.
Yeah, why use something like an easel? I don't know.
Maybe those were tariffed. I don't know.
The lumber for them's from Canada.
Yes, that's obvious. Yeah. But you saw in here, you look at this thing, you see these bunch of numbers here, a bunch of numbers, and one of the things, particularly the mathematician, you say, this one looks like double this, and this double this. Interesting that these are factor 2, except for other things that aren't, right? There's these 2-to-1 things and these same things. And you start trying to read what's going on here. This says, tariffs charged to the U.S., including currency manipulation and trade barriers. U.S. Discounted reciprocal tariffs. So he was saying, this is what these mean countries do to the United States in, quote, ripping us off. And this is the little bit of stuff that we discounted, not as much as they did. So that he's trying to say, it's not so bad because we could have been worse.
Are you suggesting that this chart is basically all excuses?
Well, it's usually in a political situation. The politician says, I'm going to have a conference about blah, blah, I'm going to present so-and-so.
This is my justification.
And the aides scramble to try and give them props to do things.
Okay.
So some poor intern probably got tasked with actually coming up with these numbers, and then someone else took credit when they say, "Oh, that looks good."
They said it was AI.
So that's the announcement. Yeah. Now it is pretty worldwide. There are exceptions, of course. Trump managed not to tariff the United States itself. That was kind of a thing. You see that Mexico and Canada were left off the list because they've already been tariffed. Now, this particular chart, no one's going to tariff Antarctica because Antarctica is not a country, it's a continent. There are a couple of missing things like Somalia that's supposed to have been colored in, and Belarus it wasn't supposed to be colored in, but there's some errors there, but this is sort of gives you an idea about it's pretty global. Of course, you say, why isn't Russia there, and why isn't Belarus there, and why isn't North Korea there? But we'll get to that.
Notably, also Canada and Mexico are not there, and that's because Canada and Mexico are in a unique other category for some reason.
And they've already been tariffed. Although, interesting enough, they didn't include Greenland, even though Greenland's part of Denmark. But
Greenland's not covered in either.
So yes, as I say, some of those are not correct. So what he did is he issued an executive order, 14,257, It says, I have declared a national emergency for conditions relating from the large and persistent annual U.S. trade deficits, which have grown over 40% in the past 5 years alone, reaching $1.2 trillion last year. The cumulative effect of these imbalances has been to transfer resources from domestic producers to foreign firms, including reducing opportunities for domestic manufacturers and to expand, and in turn leading to lost manufacturing jobs, diminished manufacturing capacity, and atrophied industrial base, including the defense sector. Right now, as I mentioned in that web page, there is a much more text to there, but this is kind of one of the things that's sort of the essence of saying there's a problem, here's a problem, under that national emergency, I am opposing tariffs, because Congress had at one time a matter that says the president can impose taxes on trade if there's a national emergency. So he said, national emergency, I'm imposing. And so he had a series of charts, right? These charts showed up in the this one showed up in the Rose Garden. The other ones Trump posted on his Truth Social, and they also subsequently released it in the White House. So there's a whole bunch of pages, right? Page, and even produced some double pages because I guess they got tired of their double pages and so forth. So we have numbers, and the first column is, of course, the country name. Second column says, get tariffs charged to the U.S., including currency manipulation and trade barriers, right? Whatever that means in terms of percentage. Versus this is what the U.S. is. So this is what he says, this is what Vietnam is doing, and the United States is doing this. Okay?
Right.
So we have this data. How do you make sense of that data? Well, the White House actually has some policies they made, right? And if you go back to their primary document, the document you'll see is which one is it? This one here, trade referential calculations. If you read some of the language and some of the confusing stuff, they make a bunch of claims. So they say the calculated rate is necessary to balance bilateral trade deficits, right? You say if the U.S. is buying more from them than selling, this tariff is going to cause that to rebalance. Now, economic theory on trade might say otherwise, but that's one of their things. And they said this assumes a persistent trade deficit is due to tariff and non-tariff factors, right? Being mean to them and playing games. Actually, it is not. It's a function of trade imbalance factor, or 10%, whichever is larger.
Right.
They said the trade rates go from 0 to 99%, which is kind of an odd number. It is an odd number, but it's an odd, they said that. Actually range from 10 to 50%, not 0 to 99. They said the weighted global average is 20%. Well, I did a calculation, and it's 16.3. So if you use the Dapper Dino creationist thing, he'd give them a pass because it's within the same order of magnitude.
Sure.
Now they have weighted average, which essentially says a country which has 10 times the trade has 10 times the factor. Not every country is its own averaging value. I'm going to leave that as an exercise to read. They said the average weighted by trade, by dollars, is 45%.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this unweighted trade average for those countries that have deficits. What do you mean deficits? Well, didn't you say the average was 20% or 16.3? No. There are a number of countries that don't have a trade deficit in the United States, and they're being tariffed. So if you put those aside and say that the mean countries that are ripping us off, trade deficit countries, they said to 50%, which is odd that the highest percentage they were charging was 50%. How could the highest percentage be 50% and the average be 50%? There's various excuses. On average, it turns out to be about 29.4%. There's excuses there because you'll see there's a factor of 2, and they may have said, well, if it's from 0 to 50, then the average must be 25. Actually, it would be the median is 25. But math is hard for them, so there's a really odd thing, and again, I will point out, you have to actually read it. It says standard deviations range to 20.5 to 31.8 percentage points. Let me say it again. Standard deviations range from this to this. So they're saying this is now standard deviations of what, right?
Right.
I took it as saying take the numbers, all these numbers here, and look at the numbers that US is charging, the yellow bits, and look at the deviation, right? I calculated deviations both for everyone and for those with deficits, and that's the deviation. Meaning, this in a bell curve, it's going to be some average value plus or minus this for a certain percentage of the items. So I don't know what standard deviations range mean. I think some intern didn't pass their statistics test or forgot it. So these are some of the calculations. So that didn't help. So I started looking at the formula. And you probably have seen there, in fact you saw it, and it had things, this little mathy thing that looks like some symbols. So let's
speak Greek.
Let's break it down. So first of all, for those that don't know your Greek letters, this thing here that looks like a Christmas tree, that's a capital delta. It's a Greek letter. This is a lowercase tau. This guy here that looks kind of like it. So the T thing is actually a Greek letter tau. The X thing looks like a chi. The E thing is an epsilon, and this squiggly, circly lollipop thing is a phi. M is a standard Latin letter. So those are the symbols. But if you look at their document and describing things in language, they say this thing here, this delta tau sub I, is a change in tariff rate for country I. So what do you mean by that? Well, there's a whole pile of countries, right? Countries, right? And so they're going to call each number, this country 1, this country 2, this country 3, number them. So we're talking about a particular country. It's a particular instance of this change, right? This chi sub I means the total exports to country I. And again, each country has their own value. The M is the total imports from the country. E is the elasticity of imports.
Okay,
and P is a pass-through.
Before you go any further, what is elasticity? Like, I can understand the charge and tariffs per country, and I can understand total exports to country and total imports from a country. Those are all pretty straightforward. What is elasticity of imports?
Well, economic theory says that when you start to increase the cost of something, you reduce its demand or desirability. So as you raise the cost of something, the number of things that people come out and buy will be less. And
so it's a variable. It changes depending on what's happening. Okay.
It's meant to actually be a function, but in this case, they have a value. So what it means is that essentially, what happens? How does increasing a tariff on something change the amount of that something being imported or exported, right? So the pass-through says, okay, let's assume that someone accepts the agreed cost and wants it. How much of that cost is passed through to the consumer, right? Does the manufacturer that's making it eat the cost? Does the shipper? Does the person at the end who buys it? What pass-through comes to import prices? Because you're trying to estimate the amount of tariffs you're going to collect.
I feel like
if you raise tariffs,
made this really complicated.
Yes, but if you raise tariffs, people are going to be less likely to buy. So the amount that the import demand will go down.
So wait, are you telling me that this equation includes the the calculation for when these tariffs that they're using this equation to apply hits. So this equation should also account for and be applicable after the tariffs have been implemented to decide what the difference was between point A and point B.
Correct, because what they're trying to do is say the calculated tariff rate necessary to balance the bilateral trade deficits, right? So what they're saying is if we add tariffs, we're going to change demand, and that's going to change the cost factor. It's going to change the amount, can't change the balance.
So they're using that as what is the equivalent of their balancing factor inside of this equation.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, if you look at and you can go to trade models, have these curves. It's kind of this. Yeah, you see these produce consumer demands where you got these two lines that come across diagonally at each other, and depending on where you're on the curve, right. the demand versus the supply changes.
I am so sorry if any of the questions that I ask sound very, very stupid. I am not the math person. And if you are watching and you have questions, please tag me. I will make sure to get those questions asked. So if there's any clarification you need on any, I know we're talking a little like these mathematics sound a little bit advanced. So please, by all means, ask clarifying questions. I will make sure those get to Landon. Please go on, Landon.
Yeah. Now, in the again, this is a document. Reciprocal trade calculations. They explain to calculate the tariffs, import, export data. They use it to show you what the data is, and we're going to go and see that sort of same thing. They selected these parameters, and they gave evidence of these papers saying that these parameters are. So they've justified it, but the way they said was that E is 4, and the epsilon is 4, and phi is 1/4. And that by the area that they claim that the tariffs are going to impact is roughly linear. There's not the curve isn't really bending. It's pretty linear. Now, I'll point out from a mathematical point of view, this is not how you multiply in equations, right? A mathematician would say epsilon, phi, and so on.
Yeah, they wouldn't add the asterisk. Yeah, it would just be side by side.
That's a silly way to specify multiplication. So so those symbols again. The change in tariff rate is exports minus imports divided by elasticity times pass through times basically your imports.
The function of minus, divide, and multiply and equals. Do those make sense in this equation? With the placement of each of these factors.
And in a general model, yes, because the reason why you're applying this to the import is that when you add tariffs, it's going to change demand, and it's going to change the price.
So the equation on its face is at least a functioning equation.
It is a model, right? Models aren't reality. Models are a way to understand what might be happening and to offer potential predictions.
Understood.
This is their trade model, right? Now, when you look at the stuff and you go a little further, okay, so here's the equation again. There's your change in tariff rate. Exports from the country, imports from the country, imports of the country, and these two factors. Well, this epsilon and phi multiply out in our one, right? They cancel each other out. What is exports minus imports? That's your trade deficit from respect to the U.S. So we can simplify this even further, right? Simplify even further, and understand. By the way, this is what they said was the calculation, but this is actually not what they did. In particular, the minimum tariff is 10%. Australia, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Belgium, Brazil, all have trade surpluses, which, remember, Trump said, we're trying to, the national emergency to try to deal with these trade deficits.
Why would you attack and destabilize something that is a positive that could become a negative when you've already got a positive if what you're trying to do is get rid of negatives? Yes.
Yes, yes. And so there's a minimum tariff of 10%. So this equation is not quite correct. You get 10% whether you like it or not. And
Right.
also there's a bunch of things as well. This epsilon, they say in their document, they talk about that the epsilon is less than 0. Let epsilon represent the elasticity of imports with respect to
Right.
import prices. Let phi represent the pass-through to import prices, right?
Right.
Again, you go out here, you can actually see the language. But the way it is, their epsilon actually is negative, right? Even though they call it 4.
Why?
So,
Why is there why? But so are you telling me that they okay? Let me understand here. Let me hold on. I'm bringing my face back for a second. Hi, it's me. I'm here. I'm listening. I'm paying attention. I got this. I'm on board. So
okay.
you're telling me that they have a feasible, reasonable equation, that they put the work into developing this equation that on its face, although maybe you wouldn't want to implement it, would at least be an equation that you could garner information from to then make decisions about. You could use it in that way.
You could build a policy, rational stuff.
Right.
But
Okay. But they didn't do that. They just arbitrarily plugged in random as fuck numbers and then said, "Look, here's our equation," and then did whatever they wanted anyway.
some intern picked a couple of papers and said, look, they use a 4 and 1/4, so we'll plug that in because
All right. All right, listen, I'm
Jesus.
really bad. I didn't do well in like junior high and high school mathematics. All right? I struggled really bad with taking quadratic equations from words and putting them in and knowing which like number represented which part of the equation, right? Like I struggled with that comprehension from one to the other, all right? Like so I can understand somebody struggling to be like, "Oh, this is the number we need to put in here." But you're telling me that the best minds, we have the best people that they have brought in to deal with this big economic crisis that's super important, then they didn't know how to put the right numbers in, or they just were flippant about it, or like they just wanted to do whatever they wanted anyway, and then just ad hoc'd this equation to be like, here's why.
Well, let me suggest this, Josh. Someone who understands economies and economics, like let's say Carney, might not have done this.
Oh, you think?
So let's go back. I wanna go back to say what's this negative bit is here. The negative bit problem, right? Remember, what's a trade deficit? That's a negative number.
Right. It should be.
Imports is a positive number, right? You're going to charge a positive rate, so you got to have a negative in here somehow.
So wait. They're just trying to remove all negatives from an equation. Is that?
Or they ignore it. Right? So the other thing is the irrational as well. This epsilon is supposed to be a -4 because it's a counteracting thing. But
are we at the point where we don't are we talking about not actually understanding what balancing an equation is? Because I feel like that might be where we're heading with this.
Yeah. So if I were to
model, he says. Sorry, go on.
I would say I would have had imports minus exports. Had this trade deficit be a positive number. I would have had E not be a constant, but a function of the import value, right? Same with phi. I would have these be a function of the values because this is just assume a constant linear relationship, and it's not. Another thing is I would not have done it based on a country, but I've said I would have had tau sub I comma j, where j is the type of product. What do you mean by that? Well, United States might buy lumber from Canada, but turn around and build boats that sell to Canada. So when you impact lumber, you impact the boats going on the other side, right? To say everything can be boiled down to a country is naive in terms of what
Well, yeah,
trade is about.
it disregards that some businesses are international and and that businesses
Yeah.
aren't necessarily loyal to a specific country, or specifically only operate or in and out of or from a country. But on top of that, it disregards the response. So like if, for example,
Yes.
let's take boating, right? And so if American
Yeah.
companies buy lumber from Canada, build boats, and then sell those boats back to Canada, and suddenly there's a massive tariff that is going to get bounced to the consumer in the consumers in America that need to buy the lumber, but then that cost then bounces back to Canadians who are buying the boats. There suddenly you've opened up a power vacuum where what's stopping a company from operating in Canada to build the boats and completely remove that cost and thus selling cheaper boats and making them more accessible and completely
Yes.
just starving that initial company out of the market.
Exactly. So let's look at this elasticity business, right? If
Right.
taxing, that's what tariff is, it's a tax. Taxing Canadian lumber causes American boat builders to have to charge more to sell boats to Canada. Canada says, well, we can buy just as good of boats from Mexico.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, or another
So,
country entirely.
I
Yeah.
mean, because they float around, Mexico does actually have a considerable a boat building thing because guess what? Mexico is a
Right.
seafaring country. A lot of the
Mm-hmm.
cuisine is in the fish and the coast and so forth. They build boats.
Yeah, believe it or
I know it
not,
sounds
Mexico, except for the northern part, is surrounded by water.
yes. So in that sense,
That's
well, the last
actually
city has to sit there.
That's actually geographically very interesting because Canada is the same but opposite. So Canada on the east coast, west coast, and northernmost coasts are all surrounded by water. America's the odd one out of being only west coast and south coast with no southern or northern access, realistically.
Sure, sure. So this is why I would have this. I would not have this as a country, but a country and type of trade. You don't have to say individual
Oh.
part,
Okay.
but see, service is different than a
Lumber,
good,
minerals,
which is storable
mm-hmm.
versus a perishable like
perishable
a
items. Yeah.
potato,
Okay.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would have models where the sub thing would be the sort of the class of the type of import, right? Is it a raw material? Is it a manufactured item? Is it lithium or is it a cell phone? Is
Right.
it a
Is it a product or a raw material? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yes, or is it a social media site, right?
Right.
That just saying everything is a country is naive. Saying these are constants are naive. They need to be a function of the particular m sub I comma j.
It's a mistake of all of these things are variables as opposed to one thing representing all variables.
And you hear Prime Minister Carney say they are going to have a targeted approach.
Mm-hmm.
What he's saying is, I'm not going to turn around and do a Trumpian thing like, well, we're just going to put this percentage on the United States. No, he looks at specific things. He looks at things to say, maybe I can put a tariff on whiskey from Kentucky and Tennessee.
It's
Because
it's
Canada has
putting the target is that there needs to be a reason why this tariff exists and what the consequences of that tariff is going to be. Like, as opposed to Trump, which just seems to be completely just a blanket, broad brush that has no definitive purpose.
And so they pick these two numbers, which turn out to be one as a linear relationship, and therefore it turns out to be that what you really are doing is this. This is the actual real equation, not the thing they put in there. You take the trade deficit divided by total imports, you have a minus 100 on this side, and you have a 2 down here. You'd say, what is this 2? What 2? What 2?
Why
what 2?
is there a 2?
Where did this 2 come from?
Yeah.
Well, if you come back to actual numbers, you'll see 17 times 2 is 34.
No.
Now this one doesn't quite work. Right? It's a 2-to-1 thing. Now they make mistakes.
Sure.
Like this Afghanistan is not quite. That's actually probably a chart error. But 18 to 35, 22 to 44, 31 to 60. Now it's within rounding errors, right? Because some portion is rounding.
Mm-hmm.
Except 10, in which case you're just screwed. So it really says you take the trade deficit, you divide by the imports, you have a minus 100 on top, so basically multiply by minus 50. And it's the maximum of that or 10%, whichever is larger, you round to the nearest number, and that's your tariff. That's why the numbers aren't quite 2-to-1 because
I like the picture in the background. Looks like a meth house that just has the word "why." Why spray painted on the wall?
Yes, again, and these are all attributable stuff. I got permission for this stuff. No artist was abused by some AI model or other theft
during the making of the slideshow. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you 4 examples. Right, Malaysia has this much, 15.7 billion imports and 2.7 exports to Malaysia. So if you do there's your trade deficit divided by trade, you get this number. You multiply by 200, you get this number. You round it up to 24, and you find 24 is in the column for Malaysia. Right? They're basically saying that because we're off by a factor of around 48, let's say rounding percent, right? The trade imbalance is that. They want to apply a 24% tariff to Malaysia to try to get this number to be closer to 0. You say, well, okay, that's kind of cute. Why didn't they do just 100%? Well, probably someone said that's even worse calamity than before. Let's take Argentina. U.S. imports this 7.1 billion from Argentina, but exports more than 9.2. So we have a trade surplus to Argentina. They're helping with this national emergency. So if you ran through the equations and ran through the Trump math, we would be giving them a 15% discount. Why? Because they are exporting. They're receiving from the U.S. 15% more than we're buying.
And if you were trying to balance everything to a sum of 0, where there is no profit and no negative, you would have to go out of your way to give more to countries, which makes no sense. Because there are developing countries that obviously are not currently exporting anything in the framework that tariffs would function in.
Yeah. So even though you would say if you did that pure equation, which is again, remember they reduce it to sort of this thing, downside over imports because everything else is 1.
Right.
That would say that we would be giving Argentina a 15% bonus. We'd be paying them. But no, the minimum is 10, so suck it up, Argentina. According to Trump.
Right.
India, right? Again, there's the import of the exports. Almost a 2-to-1 thing. It's about 52% of out of balance. So you do this times 200%, you get 26.1. 26 is 1 rounded to 26, and so there's a 26% tariff on goods from India.
So you're telling me that they just posted a bullshit equation that they weren't actually using?
Well, except for example, if they were using that equation in Australia, Australia has a trade surplus, right? They import, they import a lot more from the United States than they export.
Right.
So we would be giving them a 5% discount for being a nice trade surplus country.
Right.
We say no. We say no, yeah, or yeah, no, depending on your point of view. We won't give you 5% discount. You get 10%. So I would think what would happen is Australians might sit there and say, they might say to the United States, yeah, nah. Nah, yeah, depending on your context. You're just being and insert C word.
It's Australia, yeah. That tracks.
Go,
Just start
go,
calling people a
go,
Tesla.
go. Yeah. Yes. But so you get your four, and again you can, and the way you go about this is you go to the site, you go to a region, you pick a sub country like Eritrea, and you come in there, and it will tell you, this is White House numbers, and it'll say, here's blah blah, and we have a trade surplus. So we would have a negative value, but it doesn't matter. We're going to charge 10% on a trade. So let's find someone else.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, America is charging its allies that it has a trade surplus from more to offset the net negative that they are getting from other countries that they are then also trying to up tariffs on to balance the equation so they're no longer in a negative, which means ultimately that the Trump administration is trying to double dip.
It's impacting. No, I don't know. So I've heard rationalization saying, well, we don't want a country like Vietnam, which is going to have a big tariff put on them, swirling around and shipping them through Australia, right?
All right, fine.
But this is people coming to the Murdoch press and saying, WTF, and they go, excuse, right? Now this particular site here, again, it's all linked on their stuff. The links in.
You're sourcing. You're not even questioning whether or not the data that they are giving is correct. You're just using the data that they're providing. Yeah.
And here in Canada, it talks about the prior to this UMCA. This was the thing that Trump did. It talks about the trade thing, and it says essentially that U.S. services. So the Trump administration says for U.S. services, there's a trade surplus. Canada is buying more in services from the U.S. Now exports, there was a deficit, right? There's a trade deficit of goods here.
Sure, that makes sense.
Relative to that number, but there is a trade. But also this is their data calling out saying, but of course we're actually for services we actually have a trade surplus. Thank you, Canada. And
we're gonna stop giving you guys a fucking discount on oil. All right, get out of here.
So okay. So you have 4 examples of stuff. Now there's other bizarre things like Heard Island, McDonald Island. It's this little spot way down under, not just the land slightly down under allegedly.
Yeah.
That's Australia. This is like fairly down under. Has 0 people. But probably some intern or some staffer said, "Oh, this is a country we have to." No, it's actually administered by Australia. We have to put a 10% tariff on it. So that all those memes about penguins and so forth.
This is actually a question that came up in chat. Why tariff penguins? Is this where suits come from? And why Zelensky couldn't borrow one?
Well. Now, to understand that, Zelensky, when the war started...
No, do not get distracted by Zelensky. Oh. Don't do it.
Okay. But he's worse. When the war ends, he'll wear a suit. Otherwise, he's wearing this.
He's a wartime. He's a wartime president. It makes sense that he's wearing exactly what he's wearing.
If you look at like Norfolk Island, okay, credit, kudos. If can anyone in the chat tell me without looking up which body of water holds Norfolk Island, and what's the nearest landed country that Norfolk Island is? Do you know where Norfolk Island is? It's 2,100 people. They had a trade deficit. They have a trade deficit, $100,000, right? U.S. imported $273,000 with lots of goods and trinkets and so forth, and wonderful things in Norfolk, and they imported from the U.S. only $173,000. I think one of that was some big piece of equipment. I don't know if it was something like something related to, it was some industrial thing and some computer thing that ended up being there. But because they have this trade deficit, they got a 29% tariff because there is almost a 48% difference. We're talking about $100,000, right?
Mm.
For an island that, I understand this is kind of a one-time purchase, right? But you have these other things, the small islands where there are trade surpluses, trade surpluses, but it's a small island, but they get the Australia treatment. Yeah.
It almost
10%.
feels, it almost feels like you're splitting the hair of a coconut. Like, this doesn't matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, bizarre stuff there. So, remember, on the chart it says tariffs charged to the U.S., including currency manipulation and trade barriers.
Mm-hmm.
That chart heading is incorrect. It was trade deficits divided by trade imports as expressed as a negative percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's not tariffs charged to the U.S., including manipulating currency and trade barriers, and saying, no. It was trade deficit divided by trade imports as expressed as a negative percentage. That's the number, not what's on the chart. Mm-hmm. And the minimum tariff is 10%, right? It's not a matter of trade barriers because these countries have a trade surplus and they're being charged anyway. Now, Canada's not listed because they're already tariffed. Mexico's not listed, not tariffed. Russia, North Korea, Cuba, and Belarus are not listed. Now, you say, well, there's trade sanctions there, subject to sanctions, so there isn't really trade officially, except there is. I don't know. You could ask policy questions as to why those four are listed. But the list, if you go on the website and you count, go down these things and count countries and regions and all this sort of stuff, and you look at all the data and you look at their lists and lists of things, you find that there's 180 countries. Now there's 6 exceptions, right? So Canada, Mexico, Russia, North Korea, Cuba, Belarus are the 6 countries that are not on the list. So that's 186, but there's 193 UN member states. Now the charts, because you go and you add up, because again, we number of people, you go and count all the countries in these charts. You find you have a different number. This is a number of other things. It gets more silly because there's 185 countries on the chart with 6 exceptions. So my challenge to the chat is to tell me, look at the chart, all those things, all that stuff, right? Look at those charts and understand that these 6 countries are not part of it. Which are the 2 member states that aren't listed? Which 2 member states did they forget? Mm-hmm. Who escaped tariffs because some White House staffer couldn't understand who they are? Now, there's a bunch of problems with that actual list, right? If you look at, for example, Saint Pierre and Miquelon is part of France.
Right.
Trivia question. When they name the countries that are in North America, most people forget that France is one of the countries in North America.
Right.
But they have they got a 50% tariff.
Well, and it's the same with like the penguin portion that is actually part of Australia. I also seem to notice that this chart and these numbers seem to completely disregard any trade agreements or security and defense agreements, which also involve a lot of money.
Because normally negotiations surround those sorts of things. A place like Svalbard, right, which is actually part of Norway, but also Russia has some interest in it, is listed as a separate country. So sometimes there's things on that list that are countries. Mm-hmm. But there are at least 2 UN member states that weren't listed because the White House staff doesn't know they exist.
Right.
I'm not going to say who it is because I don't want them to be tariffed. But who escaped because someone doesn't know it's fair to say that the average American probably knows less about geography than the average non-American.
Sure.
And this is example stuff. So the tariff calculation does not equalize foreign tariffs. It's an attempt to penalize trade deficits, but it's an failed attempt because it really is a tax on U.S. purchases of goods.
Yeah, I like to take this moment to also note, if you want to talk about geography, that the map that the majority of Americans look at in school, like in grade school, is not actually an accurate representation of a world map. Like, America is larger on their maps because they're trying to teach them about America, but because it's the only map that they look at, they haven't actually noticed that America is not that big compared to every other country and continent on the planet.
It might shock some Americans to know that Canada is actually bigger.
Yeah.
Even if you ignore the very far northern frozen bits.
Yes.
So yeah, that's part of the thing. Again, their chart is incorrect. The trade equation they gave is kind of sort of a model, but they didn't follow it because of the minimum 10%. Right. And then they had countries not listed, and then countries they forgot about, and then countries they were on the chart but not listed, and down the line, who knows what's going to actually happen.
Right.
Paul Romer, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said an author committed to the norms of science should use mathematical reasoning to clarify their analysis.
And as opposed to what we just watched.
Clarify. But he coined the term mathiness. Mathiness is not intended to clarify, it's intended to mislead. In fact, some researchers use unrealistic assumptions and strained interpretations of their results in order to push an ideological agenda and use the smokescreen of fancy mathematics to disguise their intentions. Right?
Mm-hmm. Hiding behind complicated numbers and mathematics, talking to people that have been denied a well-deserved and an education that they ought to be entitled to.
Yeah, I saw a typo there. It's down with mathiness. Mathiness is a term. What we saw here with these little numbers, what we saw here with this little thing, someone saying, look, they have sophisticated things. We even have equations, right? But this stuff here that they did, and in particular this tariff calculations, is a bunch of word jumbles and someone who put together some symbols who doesn't understand mathematical notation and made it very mathy.
So it's the equivalent, what you're telling me is this is the equivalent of word salad.
Yes, mathiness. Not intended to clarify, but instead intended to mislead. The document has again links. These are nice links you can click on to get the executive order, get the annex stuff. Understand that Agent Orange is going to change its mind again and again and again. So the numbers we have won't be the numbers that will be there. For example, already China had come to 145%, right?
Yes.
So you'll see the calculations there, all the data there. By the way, there's another thing that Stand Up Mass did. He did a very good presentation as well, focusing more on the data crunching than I did. I would encourage you to watch him because Stand Up Mass is a interesting person, and so I'm doing a plug for his stuff.
By all means.
But so that's the bottom. We're going to reach the bottom of the talk.
I like your picture.
That's what it was. That's me.
All right, come on back, Landon. We got at least 2 questions from the chat.
All right, and then we can discuss more stuff. So let's go back over to here.
Welcome back. Hello. Welcome to our. Should I do our end of the stream and then come back for Q&A? Should I do our?
Yeah, we can do it. You have the little outro thing, and
I
then
got the
come
little
back for
outro
Q&A.
thing. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We're gonna go into the Q&A portion. If you're not seeing this in the future, it's because we're gonna have to get membership. So if you want to watch this in the future, help us hit that membership goal. That goal is 500 subscribers. We're 190 subscribers away, so help us join that. And we will be right back. We're not actually going anywhere. If you're watching live,
Yes,
hi,
we're
welcome
here.
back.
That's just for when you're membership. Then this becomes a bonus round for things. But do, by the
Bonus
way,
round.
folks, if you see that little like button, if you click on that, it's there. And if you really want to be nice to the Goblin, put a comment down below. Right?
Yeah, I mean, and we'll
That's
keep
a
an eye
really
out for questions. Like if you're watching this later and you actually do have a question, we'll keep an eye out for those things. I look at all the comments. But
And by the way, if you notice a typo or an error in my things, let me know and we'll correct it.
and we're gonna make sure that that PDF or that slideshow you were sharing will be linked down in the description below, so you guys can go and check it out and double check the math for yourself. So questions. Sean.
Yes.
Shano said, with Apple using the Republic of Ireland as a tax haven, how does this affect import-export deficits?
Yes, so when you have a very good question, because when you start putting on tariffs, people who are able to route around the trade damage will do so. Not everyone can. If you are a small business person who's importing Parmesan cheese from Italy, you're kind of limited to what you can do. Right. But if you're a large country that has manufacturing all around the world, you can start to adjust things accordingly. And these kind of tariffs create these seismic shifts of stuff. There's winners and losers. Now, I will say that Apple, along with people like NVIDIA, went to the White House and cut a deal, or at least got a deal there, so that now there is some level of exemption. To his question, there were people who were really good at understanding Apple supply chains and costs that were guesstimating that Trump's April 2nd Liberation Day would have taken a $1,000 iPhone for the U.S. consumer and make a cost around $2,300 US was the estimate.
If you were to move all of the manufacturing to America, like Howard Lutnick was suggesting, yeah.
Or if you did something where you look at the trade barriers that are there, but the costs are increasingly significant, like $1,700 or more. So he's right in that in the question in that when you have an impact like that, places like Ireland become more effective.
Right.
Now, we saw that with Brexit, right? Brexit was the former United Kingdom's own shooting themselves in the foot. And one of the things that happened was that people pivoted to Ireland being nearby because it was still in the EU. It still is in the EU, right? We saw that things like so when these tariffs and trades comes in, those that can pivot will. If you are manufacturing something and your supply, let's say you're a domestic U.S. manufacturer, but your supply comes from places that now have tariffs, you might have to try to find suppliers in other locations. Or what someone will do is say, there's this high tariff on Vietnam things. Well, let's have the Vietnam company open up a plant in, I don't know, Australia, and employ Australians, and we'll send over the two final pieces to Australia, where an Australian goes snap, put them together, and now it's Australian made. They'll try to pass it off as from Australia. It only gets 10% because why? Because it is
a pipe dream, and it is absurd for anybody to think that you can move manufacturing back to America using these tariffs, or that you could buy
Instantaneously.
things that are American made. At the end of the day, there's a reason why Canadian products have listed things like product of Canada or made in Canada, right?
Yes.
And there are still percentages within that give these companies wiggle room to be like, listen, is the majority of your stuff made, sourced, produced, and factored here? Or are you something that has, like, most of your stuff is made out and then it's assembled here? Right? These things matter, and there's
Yes.
wiggle room here, and it's a pipe dream to pretend that America has enough resources on its own to maintain itself. It doesn't. It doesn't have that. It doesn't exist.
Yeah,
By
and
no
if you're
metric.
buying a Mercedes from Germany, but that steel came from China,
And it's absurd to say the same thing about
EU or tariff China. Yeah.
Right, and it's the same thing to say about the same thing about Canada. There's Polyev, the conservative leader in Canada, who's like the Maple MAGA guy, is like trying to tell people that we're gonna have Canadian cars, and I'm like, what Canadian cars? We have so much automotive manufacturing in Canada, and so much like of the resources for automotive is Canadian based. There is no Canadian car. Like, you have German cars, you have UK cars, you have Chinese cars, you have Toyota, you have Ford, you have Chevy, you have fucking BMWs. There is no Canadian brand of finished car. It doesn't exist.
And even this comes to the point of saying that what is when someone says made in blah blah blah, they're
Right.
probably they could say it's finally assembled, right? Is you buy a jigsaw puzzle, is the assembled jigsaw puzzle someone that poured jigsaw into a box and wrapped it, or is it the person that made the cardboard, or the person that made the picture, or
Did
sold
the
contract?
cutting? Yeah.
Yeah, all these things are become really complex, and if you had that, if someone said, hey, let's take and build a plant in Canada because it makes sense for Canada having better trade with the rest of the world, well, then the next thing comes along, you get a conservative government in Canada who then turns around and messes up Canadian trade because they act all MAGA-like. And now your investment in some multi-million to billion-dollar car becomes gone, right?
Yeah.
People look at the list of tariffs that Agent Orange Trump is doing, and how frequently he's putting them on and taking them off. No one in their right mind would invest in the United States because they don't know what the actual result will be, right? If he's just exempted cell phones and laptops and computers and GPUs, whatever that means. If you had just said, oh, we got to move our GPU manufacturing back to the United States, all of a sudden now it's gone. Why would you have something built in Taiwan? Because the labor there costs less than the labor in Canada or the United States.
Yeah. I just think it's absurd to try to sell people a made-up brand. Like, Kinder is pointing out Bricklin was Canadian, and they're all in museums. Yeah, because we don't make them here. The brand doesn't exist anymore. There is no Canadian brand. But it's absurd to sell Canadians this idea that we're going to, like, invest in Canadian cars when there is no Canadian car. Like, it's ridiculous.
And back to the question.
Yes. Tax haven.
Pivoting to a place right now like Ireland with major infrastructure may be a mistake because of that tax haven change can quickly evaporate. If it turns out that other places in the world put more excessive tariffs on the EU, that all that thing can evaporate. If you have a complex product like a cell phone, you want to have a diverse set of suppliers so that one typhoon someplace doesn't wipe out your brand. You want to diversify so that a political situation doesn't doom yourself. So You
Yeah.
justify it that way. But you can't turn around and say, oh, there's a guy in the White House who doesn't really seem to understand much in the way of economics, who every other day changes. Again, you look at that list of tariff announcements. It's a long list that's growing longer, right? Already, the data we presented has changed.
Right.
And it was just a number of 7 days later, right? How can someone make a major investment by building a clothing manufacturing plant or a screw assembly plant in the United States if what's going to happen is there's going to be in a couple of days a change or a different administration, right? The result is that people will go and move towards stability, even if there's claims that you can get a little bit off if you go here, right? Because being stable, because you can't just a long-term say, new factory, new people, everyone employed, yay. That isn't how economies work.
There's the next question is from Letty that says, Landon, does it make sense for there even to allow no imports in the equation, even though that's a real thing? Like mathematically having no imports, zero on that equation is theoretically a thing. Does the equation actually allow for it?
Yeah, so to give you a hint, you might find that the amount of imports from Vatican City is zero directly. Now, tourism brings a lot of stuff back in, but that's not really imports of things.
For whatever reason, tourism is not part of this equation. Yeah.
You'd have a divide by zero problem for that. So yes, if you had an entity like there is no trade with Antarctica, so you made Antarctica a country, which is not. But hey, they make Salvador a country, or they make Don Lyons their own country. Why not make Antarctica as a continent a country? I don't know. That you'd have to plug in zero.
Right.
But it appears, based upon the charts and the tables, that some people in the White House are challenged in geography. You heard, if you listened to that embarrassing press conference, Agent Orange was saying,
which one? That embarrassing press conference.
Yeah, he doesn't understand. He didn't heard of countries, right? But he's applying this thing now. The Murdoch press is having to work overtime to figure out how to put rose-colored lipstick on a dead and putrefying pig corpse. And
I like when Landon doesn't hold back.
They know from the people that have real money. I'm not talking about Space Karen's fake Tesla stuff.
Stock money, yeah. Real
trade,
money.
International trade is trillions of dollars, people that are behind the scenes. Those people are not happy that they're having to shift stuff around as a result. Some of them have gone to the White House and have actually bribed the President of the United States with money.
Besides the bribery part, does it not seem, besides the problem of bribery, does it not seem, because this is like the second or allegedly. This is like the second or third time you've brought up that there are companies and people that have the ability to go to the president to make like proposals on behalf of not countries. These aren't like presidents or elected officials or otherwise that represent countries. These are people who represent finance groups, people who represent hedge funds, people who represent major industries. Do you not think that it is not very democratic or not very fair to the American people or the American business owner that they do not have that same access to the president?
Yes, because that's what Bernie Sanders is saying. We have an oligarchy running the executive branch. People that have the power can get a hold of it and actually cause things to change, right? This Liberation Day was a big thing that he was celebrating, giant accomplishment. And already people came to him and whispered and says, okay, I'll make a scepter here, blah, blah, blah. Now, understand, I'm not blaming Apple or Nvidia.
Yeah, this is not about
going to the White
blame. This is
House.
about acknowledging what is the case and is it or is it not fair, right? This isn't one-stop problems shop, right?
Oh, people leading major corporations need to set aside their politics right now to try to get a deal, because otherwise they'd be on the screwed end of things. Now,
Right.
you know, I can imagine right now is happening is that because Apple appears to be a break on things like iPads, computers, laptops.
Yeah, I mean
imagine,
the car company's got a stay of an amount of time and such. Yeah, they're not the only ones.
I imagine the Google twins might want to, or probably having their folks make sure that the Android has a similar thing, because when you saw those, I was showing you something about all those codes and numbers. You want to be sure that those codes are listed in the tariff stuff. Now, I'll tell you, when you go across the border, you bring stuff back, and you talk to the people that are in charge of actually charging the tariffs, you find, here's a hint, these tariffs aren't being collected even now. They have no idea what to do. They've been not given instructions, and they recognize that
it's fluctuating.
That the tariffs are changing all the time. So they don't even bother.
Yeah. So the actual people on the ground doing the work are like,
well, because what else are you gonna do?
What are you supposed to do? I don't know. There's no winning here.
It is a case, but that's a good question. Any other questions on there or general comments?
Yeah. We got a question from Sean again, like a follow up. With American micro devices using Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company fabrication in Asia, then assembling it in Vietnam with low costs, has this increased the trade deficit? So, like, is this equation and is this whole scenario taking into account that is the trade deficit increased with Vietnam, or is it increased with Taiwan? And is Taiwan considered a country in this list, or is Taiwan under China in this list?
Well, so I'm looking at the set here. Taiwan has a 32% Liberation Day tariff.
So is this accidentally America and Donald Trump acknowledging Taiwan as its own country?
Now we mentioned Taiwan was mentioned. Yeah, but yeah, no. But Reunion Island. Technically, France is not its own country. It's part of, you know.
Listen, I'm for Taiwan being its own country, and I am also so amused by Trump doing everything so badly and so wrong and being so awful that he keeps just accidentally doing the things.
as I reminded a Chinese Communist Party person who's also a shill, member of the shill.
Yes.
Taiwan has never been under the control of the Chinese Communist Party.
Sure.
And for the Chinese Communist Party to claim to be part of China causes them to lose face because the rest of the world laughs at their ridiculousness. Now, you mentioned, the person said, they mentioned Taiwan, Vietnam. What are the other countries?
They said American micro devices using Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing companies' fabrications in Asia and then assembling them in Vietnam.
Yes. Now, the problem is if it ships from Vietnam, it's 46%. If it ships from or is tagged as being from Taiwan, it is 32%. If, on the other hand, it was deemed to be part of computers and laptops, which has a January 9th exemption, then it has 0%. So it kind of depends upon how you spin it.
So now you're talking about marketing. How are you marketing it? Are you marketing it as from China, or are you marketing as from some specific part of Asia?
Now you look at India is 26% under the current Trump tariffs. So you saw Apple ship an entire cargo plane full of iPhone parts to India. Why? Because they could have it assembled in India, cheaper and ship it to the U.S. cheaper than it was from Vietnam or from Taiwan or China, right? Now, I don't think that's a long-term thing because they apparently were able to get hold of the White House to cause them to put on hold the tariffs on their particular parts and their end supplies. But the problem is that if you are manufacturing a cell phone, you are receiving parts like screens and lithium batteries and wires from other places. What you have to do is to have it be assembled in a country that can receive those goods without a bunch of tariffs coming in. But again, the market reacted more to the uncertainty,
yes,
rather than the craziness. And when he goes and says, "Yeah, but blah blah blah," okay, but blah blah blah, but blah blah blah, right?
For example, right, you're looking at, according to the numbers released by the U.S. government, this is according to Jason, who left a comment that says, according to the numbers released by the U.S. government, Canadians spend 18% of their average income on U.S. goods, while Americans spend 2% of their average income on Canadian goods. Does that count towards these deficits? And the answer is no. There is no actual consideration. It's just a wide brush that's just being thrown across completely haphazardly with complete disregard for what would actually be beneficial to Americans.
And one of the things that's been impacting is rail.
Yes.
Pre-Trump era, it was often cheaper for someone in BC to ship through rail to the United States, across the United States, and up into, let's say, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
Than to try and go across provinces which had their own wacky stuff. Canada is a collection of interesting provinces and territories.
You got a bunch of different economies that are all then lumped together, and they're working on changing that, so we'll see how that goes.
But it was oftentimes
a
case where products would go into the United States and back over to Canada, especially during the Trump no tariff regime that he negotiated. And that was somewhat to the detriment of Canada. Now, there's claims that the provinces are going to be nicer about bringing stuff over, but again, go to a provincial liquor store in a province and try to find wine in the neighboring province.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've seen people be critical to say that, oh, do you actually think that interprovincial trade in Canada is going to affect your day-to-day life? Like, why do you care? And the answer is one, it's better for us ultimately, overall, even if it doesn't direct your bottom line, it's better for us nationally. But the other thing is, I want to be allowed to buy Quebec cheese and Nova Scotia wine, so my personal charcuterie boards just have an overall quality bump. Thank you very much.
Yes, that's exactly. And as one of the top reviewers of Canadian wine in the United States, I can tell you that the variety of Canadian wines are exceptional. However, you'll find that even wine enthusiasts in Canada and the province are woefully ignorant of Canadian wine.
Of other Canadian wines. It's so sad. It's so sad. It's not about whether or not it affects your day-to-day life as a wine drinker. It's about coming together as a country. And one of the things that brings Canadians together is alcohol. Whether you like it or not, it's just a fact of the matter, and it's just the way it is. Sean again brings a follow-up and says, if there was a consultation process, would the perception of special deals in public looked corrupt?
No, there's a consultation. If the normal trade consultations are where you have delegations that go back and forth to discuss matters, so that people understand the notion of, hey, we're trading access to this mineral resources for this labor, or for access, that is there are things besides actual currency that go into a negotiation, such as saying, you really want to have the dairy be able to be sold for the United States into Canada, but you don't want it to be a flood. So what they actually did, and Trump negotiated this, was to say that a person bringing a certain amount of dairy from the United States into Canada had 0 tariffs, and when you reach the threshold, you began to get a large tariff, because it says personal consumption is fine, but mass shipping is not. And so there are many Canadians that sit just on the other side, just right over there, because I see Carney's Crevasses. Used to be called Trudeau's Ditch. Now Carney's Crevasse, right over there, and they come over
Listen,
here
at
to
least
the dairy
it's not
to buy.
considered the Canadian pre-trench yet.
Yes. Yeah, but they come over to buy buy dairy here, because we have really good dairy and our prices are pretty good. But the dairies here can't turn around, instead of an export thing, and flood the market that would make it difficult for Canadian dairies. So they negotiated an agreement saying personal consumption, but not mass importation. That's an example that came from consultation where both the Dairy Association in BC and Dairy Association in the state of Washington came to an agreement. These are how these things are negotiated. And when you look at the actual trade things, you have experts that sit there and say, yes, but you have this fertilizer that is really good, it's really effective. So if you want that, could you let our soap in at a discount rate? And they go, yeah, well, I don't know. And so they go back and forth.
Yes,
Okay,
no,
I
yes.
tell you what. Okay, you get this fertilizer because it helps making corn, fertilizing fields for corn, and we'll take the soap that's produced from corn and sell it to you.
So between nation to nation, it works and it makes sense. But how does that apply when suddenly an entire nation, i.e. America, stops applying this from a nation to nation basis and starts applying it to company? That NVIDIA is going to the President of the United States, or Ford, or the automotive industry as a collective, as like, I don't know, a union almost is going to the America. Is that not looking like less of reasonable negotiation between nations, and now looking absolutely absurdly corrupt?
Exactly, because it's that M sub I comma J stuff I was suggesting is how those things get finely tuned. If you go to a customs person and ask to say, show us your stuff, you'll find binders and binders of very complex regulations that are being updated, where they determine to say, this is a law, but it's under this code, so There's a complex set. And the rolling out, when things like the North American trade was renegotiated, it took a couple of years before the regulations were printed enough that the people who did the actual tariffing understood, right?
It actually trickled the way through the process. Yeah.
Right now, there's a lot of tariffs that U.S. Customs is not collecting. Why? Because Doge came in and fired a bunch of people. And then they said to people, oh, don't do trade stuff. Go in and grab illegals and fentanyl users.
And you can't just turn a tariff on and off in the White House and expect it to apply one day versus another day. It doesn't work like that. Like, it just you have to. As much as people in America and Canada and around the world are panicking and trying to figure out what prices are going to be, you are not yet seeing the result of what is happening in your day-to-day store. You're going to see some fluctuation, but you are not seeing, like, what the end result is going to be. You're nowhere near that yet. One of the biggest thing that's going to be affected in America is going to be farming. You've got recently announced that China is no longer buying beef from America, and they're instead making deals with Australia. So Australia is eventually going to see a change in their economy and their pricing, but that's going to take a couple of months to a year or two to actually hit. For example, the American farmers who produce beef are going to see that hit, but it will not be right away. The same thing with like potash in Canada. America is going to be paying more in potash overall, regardless of what these tariffs end up being or not being, because at the end of the day, Canada's already cut America off from whatever prior relationship we had, meaning we are going to be renegotiating whatever that looks like. And so you might not even see what those tariffs end up looking at had they been allowed to go all the way to fruition, which they likely won't, because whatever agreement is going to be made between the new administration and the American administration. So will America still get a deal on potash? Yes, probably, but that negotiation is not going to be nearly as friendly or American positive as it was prior to any negotiation. So likely you're going to get fucked.
Yeah, and as I was going to say, let's say you're trying to negotiate potash and say, hey, we'd like some potash at a better price. To say yes, but we would like the batteries that you're assembling of lithium batteries to come to us.
The good faith, yeah, the good faith agreements and the good faith negotiation is.
But what country is going to sit there and say, yeah, we'll agree to that, but who knows what Agent Orange is going to do tomorrow?
Tomorrow, right, exactly. Or, and again, I think you agree with me on this, it's not about Trump alone. It's, we don't know if the next person you elect in is going to do the exact same thing or do the complete opposite, or the person after that, or the person after that, or the next person after that is going to be even worse, because this is a structural problem.
Yes. Yes, and try not to think of this as, oh, this is just Trump being bad.
Yeah, right.
This is populism showing up. And understand that Canada is just, one or two elections away from electing their own populists to do their own thing, right? Populism, it seems to be this disease, which political malaise, which is affecting all over the world, right? And even if Trump were to decide, hey, I'm retiring and going to golf, do what you're going to do, and leaves, that doesn't solve the U.S. problem, because what's happening there is that a U.S. company is going to look at a potential populist in Canada and ask, okay, maybe Carney is going to be elected prime minister in this next election, but what about 5 years from now?
Right. Is the structure in Canada stable versus is the structure in America stable? Yes, no. If X, Y, or Z, if Carney gets voted in, or if Poilievre gets voted in, will the economic structure be a stable environment to invest in? Yes or no? And those are decisions. That's the risk of investment, right? That's the risk that you're taking.
So even if somehow Congress were to get together and impeach and convict Trump,
it's not going to.
That would not solve the problem, because we still have MAGA and we still have populism. And the thing that's impacted U.S. more is your reputation, right? Why would somebody want to trust a good faith negotiator in the United States? If remember, from Canada's point of view, it was Trump that negotiated the Canadian deal in the first place. He said it was perfect. He was the one who set up this thing. He turned around and said, no, it's bad, and put all those tariffs on it.
It's absurd.
And when people asked him, he said, yeah, but this is new. Right? This is now perfect, right? You can't. It's the reputation of being unreliable that is going to hurt the American consumer more than if these tariffs are temporary.
And I do want to point out that Jason said counting non-monetary restrictions is bad for us to do to our higher food restrictions, like food coloring and chlorine-rinsed chicken. Like, it's this complaint that Americans have this facetious complaint that I've seen going around, the Republicans going around on Fox News, right, and saying, like, hey, they don't buy our beef, they don't buy our chicken, they don't buy our meat. And it's like, yeah, because your meat doesn't meet our fucking standards for meat. So if you can't sell in a place. Not everywhere is America. Different countries have different standards. Different countries have different regulations. It's just like Tesla got told to go suck ass because they wanted to have a proprietary electric plug, and the UK told them no. They were like, you have to use a universal plug that functions over here that any other electric car will be allowed to plug into. Because we're not going to let you monopolize the access to electricity because that's bullshit. And Canada didn't do that, and I'm still mad about it. Yeah, I'm not going to let it go.
Yeah. And so this is why in normal political leadership, when you see the leader of country blah and country blah come together at some press conference, they have their joint flags behind them, and there's a whole bunch of things, and they clap, and they have a handshake, and they sit down, and they sign a bunch of things. That document says relatively little. All it says is, our people and your people will get together to hammer out the details. Here is our general intent.
Yeah.
And when something like trade comes on, that's when negotiation occurs. This is where the Association for Booksellers and Bookbinders makes sure that book binding and selling is a different product category, so it can be negotiated with a tariff.
Yeah.
This is, and so the result is, when you, again, if you go to someone who's involved with customs or go to a border thing and stop and just say, I'm just curious, can you show me what it looks like? You'll see binders and binders and binders of detailed, dense regulations.
You want an example? If you look at the book, if you buy a book and you look at the back of that book where it shows the price. I don't know if it's gonna do it. Give me focus. It's not gonna focus. It says $16 US, $18.99 CAD.
And to some extent, the value of the Canadian dollar relative to the US dollar is one of the ways that the trade between the United States and Canada is managed.
Oh yeah. And you want to know what never changes? That price does not change day to day. It's priced based on the printing of the book, of when it was printed.
Yes. Now, in some sense, the store can go and slap on another sticker to say it's now this cost for something. But yes, understand that in the old regime, if the Canadian dollar became more valuable than the US dollar,
yes,
it would impact Canada significantly with regards to trade. Because all of a sudden we find that these nice Canadian things that we buy become expensive because their dollar now is harder to is there. So when your currency strengthens, it means that other people have to get more of their currency to buy the same thing.
Yes.
So example of a strong Canadian dollar relative to US dollar would impact significantly trade between the US and Canada.
Yes.
Just the other way around as well. If Canadian dollar became super weak relative to US, would it be somewhat parity? But why would it be parity? Because what's a Canadian dollar worth? Right? Is a Canadian dollar? It's if you're from France, you got a euro. Would you do a 1-to-1 change with Canadian dollar? Is that a fair trade? Is it not a fair trade? Well, it depends upon currency. So you look at the currency markets. That's one of the things that's been going boing because of the uncertainty. Right? The VIX is a volatility index. It says how wacky are the markets just doing the bouncy stuff. Because high VIX is bad because you can't count on a rational change of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Things happen, but what are the chances that next week Trump will come up with another trade idea?
Yeah, fucking.
What are the chances that the deal that
you have
NVIDIA
no idea
and Apple made?
Yeah, you have no idea.
I mean, maybe he decides that NVIDIA pissed him off because he heard a vice president of NVIDIA say something nasty about Trump. And so he's now like, I don't like you anymore. NVIDIA bad. He goes to a conservative political action conference and says NVIDIA, a bunch of a bunch of lefty woke loser people, because NVIDIA has a practice of hiring people based upon their qualifications. Can you imagine hiring somebody based upon their qualifications?
Based on merit?
That's too woke. So she goes and said, NVIDIA's a woke company, don't buy NVIDIA, right? And now all of a sudden, there's negotiation they had falls out the window because of the whim of somebody.
Yeah, because America is no longer a reliable trading partner because it's just on the whim of whoever happens to be president at the time, and there's no consistency in what the president can or cannot do. There are no restrictions. And this is what I mean by it's a systematic problem. The system that should have been in place, the stopgaps that are supposed to be there, the things that curtailed Trump the first time he was in office, are not there to curtail him the second time, or at least so it appears to outsiders. Now, Americans might not feel that way, and that's totally fine, and it's totally viable for you to feel that way, and it's totally viable to want to trust in your system and put in efforts and have rallies and have filibusters and have bills and stuff brought forward into the House, and do your midterms, do your 2016 or your 2026 midterms, etc., etc. Do that. I'm not saying don't do those things. I'm simply saying that as an outsider, specifically, especially as a Canadian, from Canada's perspective, this is being looked at as not just a Trump problem because you already got your free pass on it being a Trump problem the first time. So now it is a structural problem because the things that should have stopped Trump didn't, and the things that ought to be in place to curtail him now aren't doing that, and we are paying the price for that. And there's no reason for us to be like, oh, Trump's not there this time. This definitely won't happen again, based on nothing.
Exactly. and to say that even at the end of the Trump administration, who's to say that the next administration, even if it's a person from the other party, won't have a similar problem with Congress, right? There's a structural problem that is there. So if I were to try to address other countries, I would, and I'm in opposition, I would first say, okay, I can't fix it. I'm in opposition. I can only try to mitigate stuff. But this is what I want to do, is to put in programs to restore confidence in the American economic system for those that are outside the United States, and to restore some level of consistency. One of the things I'm working on right now, talk about, rather than putting out a video saying, please like us, don't be mad at us, I'm working helping some legislators come up with a way by which they can take away the emergency that Trump has said. The legality of what Trump says is based upon this. Trump says national emergency. There's this law that allows him to then go and make trade stuff. So one of the things that Congress can do by resolution is to say there's no emergency. That's not a law that Trump has to pass.
Right.
That would then allow people to sue and say, hey, there's no emergency. Congress just passed a resolution saying so. And then they could. The other question, of course, is whether or not the executive branch has the constitutional authority to oppose tax, because that's what tariff is a tax, right? And so I believe that it's Congress is the one, particularly because the money bill would have to start in the House of Representatives, be passed by the Senate and then signed by the president in order to enact a tariff, right? You want to slow down the ability of someone just to, on a whim of, I don't like you because you said something mean to me, so here's 145% tariff, whatever the thing is. You want to be able to, I want to be able to put in measures that in the future will show there's going to be a better chance of some consistency. Mm-hmm. And to slow down the tariff stuff so that a new administration, if they're going to work with Canada, will have to have their trade negotiators come in. This won't be the new president saying, I will undo this, right? Because that's also not realistic, right? You have to have negotiators work.
Wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm seeing, this is just my perspective, and I'll let you answer and then we'll probably wrap it up because we're getting close to the 2-hour mark. Because I want to talk about something like maybe positive that people can do. about however they feel about things. There are rallies, these anti-oligarchy rallies that are Bernie Sanders and AOC centric. Now, I don't want to focus on AOC or Bernie Sanders because I think they're tertiary to the way Americans feel, right? They're more of like a vessel to rally around as opposed to like the actual viability of the way Americans feel and what Americans can do about it. They're holding these rallies and they're getting a lot of people showing up, right? However, the biggest thing that is currently curtailing Trump's activity is the courts, is the court system.
Yeah.
So the pressure is not on these Supreme Court judges that have actually been stacked in Trump's favor over the years. Would it not be valuable to hold these rallies in and around where these judicial decisions are being made to show either support one way or another against or for Trump, depending on what the American people want? Because I'm not here to tell you what you want, right? I'm here to simply tell you what, or posit the idea that would it not be effective to hold these rallies where these judges and these lawyers and these people are being pressured by a government administration that is holding like a quote-unquote sword of Damocles over their heads, where the people are actually rallying around them, freeing them up, or at least giving them the wherewithal to be like, no, this is what the people want, which is theoretically, maybe not in practice, you'll have to try it and see, theoretically more powerful than the threat of the singular presidential office.
I see the one thing, so I hear what you're saying, and there's some merit to what you're saying. However, courts have typically been very reluctant to let a crowd dictate their processes.
That's not true, though. Come on, we're talking like fucking. Why wasn't Trump thrown in contempt while he wasn't president? Why wasn't he jailed? Because the court was afraid. Yeah, the court was afraid of the repercussions of the people.
So here's where I would put pressure on the Justice Department.
Oh yeah.
Forward these things.
Sure.
I would put pressure on the Supreme Court.
But how are you going to put pressure on Pam Bondi, man? Like, how are you going to do that?
Yeah. And then I would put pressure on because also the Congress can overrule the courts. Right, they can. They can do things.
All right. So
and
pressure
so
on Congress.
I would put pressure. I would be less interested in a specific trial, and more interested in putting pressure on senators appointing good justices of federal benches.
Well, yeah, but now you're talking about long term. That's not going to deal with the short term, right?
Yeah, and that's part of the problem is some of these things are long term. I get your point, and I'm just asking here's some other things to consider.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say that you need to do this or this is the only way. I'm just positing like, would this be a viable thing to do? And it seems like the answer is yes. It might backfire, but also here are some long term things you could also do.
So Americans, beyond being embarrassed by what's happening, need to think about what can we do to change the direction? What can we do to demonstrate effective change in direction, right?
Have you considered taking a page out of France's book?
Yes and no, because France, I'm going to get in trouble with this, but France has some really significant defects in their system, right? I'm glad I'm not under French system from that side of view. France, you do you, and understand that the world appreciates French culture and French language.
You don't have to take everything from every single place. The point is to acknowledge that other people exist. They have different ways of doing things, and sometimes you can adopt some of those things without taking the bad. You can just take the good stuff.
Yes, and so I think if Americans become more active in expressing themselves,
sure,
in direct ways. But all as well is to help legislators begin to produce policy. Even if right now it fails because they're in opposition and don't do it, the thing you find is that a bill may be introduced again and again and again. And when you produce it, the opposition beats it back,
Cough,
and you
cough, Roe v.
learn
Wade.
from that. Yeah, you learn from that and move forward, right? So example is there are plans in place for reforming the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And that is something which is going to take time. So some of these, because some of the damage has been done by the reputation of the United States,
yes.
It's not going to be turned. You can't instantly get someone in to say, "Sorry, Trek Canada."
Thank you, nice Canada. Now. Please be our friend still.
You have to demonstrate that, and that's going to take time.
Yes.
Even if you came in and you said, "We're going to undo all the tariffs," right? Understand that undoing the current tariffs creates its own calamity. If you just eviscerate everything, right? You have to have negotiation where you renegotiate things to try and
the next administration, if the next administration is not a Trump-alike or Trump-adjacent administration, is going to spend its next 4 years just renegotiating with every other country. That alone.
And especially with Canada and its provinces, right? Now, one thing as well, I would recommend that Americans do is learn a little bit of history about the United States and Canada. Understand that this current conflict and is one of a long train of usurpations and disrespects, right? From both sides. U.S. and Canada will have a friendly border because we're not shooting across each border too much. It does happen. That's another story.
People legitimately just don't notice that Canada has its hand in a lot of cookie jars and fucks with a lot of shit. It's just we're just not as noisy about it.
But understand that the history of the United States and Canada and their respect and disrespect, ebbs and flows, it's been cycle, right? And you can go back to a couple decades when you had. I do remember as a kid going into Canadian stores and seeing American product turned upside down.
Oh yeah.
And labels saying "proudly grown Canada," because at that time there was another U.S.-Canada dispute, right?
Spats.
Understand that a little over 110, 120 years ago, the United States was considering invading Canada. You ever heard a guy named Teddy Roosevelt? Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin, the early guy, Mr. Rough Rider, so forth. He had this motto of manifest destiny to the North. He believed the United States' destiny was straight up north to the pole, right? And he saw in the middle of this thing called Canada, these territories that were, one, lightly populated, and two, mostly full of Americans who had gone across the border illegally. Americans illegally entering into Canada, farming in Canada. And the result was you had places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba having more American citizens than people that claim to be Canadian, right?
That and on top of the Underground Railroad, which ended in Canada, by the way. Like, the end of the railroad came out into Canada. Like, there's if you look at the amount of when Canada is talking about illegal immigration, we're not talking about brown people coming from other countries. We're talking about Americans that are not properly filling in their paperwork when they come over here and they're not leaving.
And one of the things that ended a big migration was when President Carter gave amnesty to people that dodged the draft. Of the Vietnam War. Because if you were of draft age and you could sneak across the border and Canada kind of knew what you were doing, you could be granted asylum in Canada. Except that you then had a bunch of people, instead of trying to become Canadian, became obnoxious Americans being entitled.
And it's not like that there are Canadians that also are like obnoxious Canadians who are like, we don't like the rules here, we're gonna go be American instead, and it's like, okay, bye.
And those fleeing the Vietnam War draft learn, don't go to Alberta.
Right.
There are people that would consider it to be fun sport to arrest a drab dodger and smuggle them back across the border and turn over saying, "Get this person." Ha ha ha. That was a thing, right? This cross-border stuff. Americans learn about the so-called War of 1812 and the burning of the White House and Windsor, Detroit burning each other's towns down and back and forth and back and forth. The Americans capturing Montreal but giving up because they got sucker punched because. All I'm saying is, just
Montreal is the best place you could pick, I promise.
Just say, imagine if we'd stayed there, what would have happened?
Good luck.
That became.
It's one of those things where it's just like, imagine if Canadians continued to occupy the White House. Like, it doesn't work.
Imagine if New Brunswick decided to be disloyal to King George and became another colony, right?
Right, exactly.
All I'm saying is take a look at the history.
Yep.
You'll see unique things, but you'll see patterns.
Mm-hmm.
You'll understand that neither side has been the best of neighbors, and at times have been really good neighbors, right?
I would still argue that we are still the best of neighbors when you compare us to other neighbors around the world. Comparatively.
Exactly.
Our continent's pretty peaceful comparatively, but that doesn't mean we don't fight.
Comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
Now, of course, and let's not talk about the invasions into Mexico and the land grab and all this other thing there, because Mexico has been far less effective in countering American aggression on the border than Canada has.
Yeah.
But as I say, it's an interesting thing. The Canadian invasions in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Americans. Canada has invaded the United States. Back in there, it's not just South Park. But there is something coming forward. Expect a South Park show having to do with Canada and the United States, and maybe some
spoilers. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to end it there. Thank you, Landon, for coming and explaining some of this. If you have any questions for math, or if you've done any math of your own, please feel free to leave a comment down below. If you have a favorite Canadian versus American conflict throughout history that you would like to share with us, or talking point from history that you would like to share with us, whether it be like Lincoln, whether it be John A. Macdonald.
What happened with Al Capone trying to move into Canada? What happened with Al Capone in Canada?
Yeah, Prohibition, absolutely. Leave it down below. Let us know. Thank you so much. We're going to get on out of here. Thank you so much, Landon. We really appreciate it. And we will see you all next time. Check out South Park coming soon. Bye.
Yes.